we have now gone through one of the examples of Sharia, the amputation of hands. What I would like to ask Lloyd to do is to show us really what Sharia is. Now, I don't want you to give us a whole rundown. You can do that, and you're very capable of giving us all the details of all the substructures and all the minutiae on what it means. That's not what I want to hear from you. What I'd like you to help us with, Lloyd, is why is these practices, these four schools of fiqh, why are they important for Muslims today, and what should we do about it? Where should we, or should we be concerned about this law called Shariah Law? Over to you.
Hi Jay, good to be back. When you look through the Quran as an individual, you can come to a different conclusion to another individual who reads the Quran or reads the Hadith. You might read a different Hadith, come up with a different opinion, different conclusion. There are contradictory verses, contradictory Hadiths. So Muslims needed, because of this, unfortunately, this confusion that was being caused, they needed a single set of firm ideas, principles they could rely on. What was abrogated, what is no longer relevant, what is the final interpretation by the best scholars of Islam, and that is the Sharia. This gives them the bedrock upon which they can interpret everything. But also that interpretation is now done, that exegesis is now finished, and now they can move forward and apply this as a legal system to manage their future caliphate, to manage their affairs. So the Sharia, from our perspective, it gives us huge explanatory power. It explains how Muslims do things. For instance, does the Quran have detailed instructions on how to perform the 5 daily prayers? The full instruction as a Muslim is taught as a child, does it have that?
No, in fact,
no.
The Quran only says 3 prayers. Only the other two, the 2 in the evening, are only introduced with Al-Bukhari in 870, the later 9th century.
Correct. Now the Sharia took roughly 900 years to complete. So it was not something that happened overnight, but if you want to learn how to perform the prayer and you want to understand, there's over 100 pages in the Reliance of the Traveler, for instance. There's over 100 pages of description of prayer. So you will learn everything about Islamic prayer that you ever wanted to know, but were afraid to ask. So you can get clarity, you can get finality within the Sharia. You don't do your own interpretation. In fact, this is illegal for Muslims to do. So we go to the Sharia. This gives us this clear understanding of how is all this interpreted, what's still relevant, so it gives us explanatory power. It explains everything in detail. It goes to great lengths to explain what Muslims do, why they do these things, and how they do these things. You want to learn how to pray? There's several pages of instruction that explains exactly what you need to do to perform the prayer in the mosque. That's not present in the Quran. And also from a security point of view, that being my background, this would also define threat doctrine, enemy threat doctrine. This says what are their plans on a personal level, because the Sharia happens at a personal level within a Muslim, but also on a social level within your town, your household, your village, your community, your nation, the planet. It describes all of this clearly for us.
Okay, so that's obvious that it does take what the Quran is saying, expands upon what the Quran is saying, applies what the Quran is saying to a real life situation. So that's where the deen, the practices of Islam come in, is what you're saying. It is actually how it's to be lived out, how it's to be practiced. Obviously,
these are general rules. Yep.
But yes, there are. But as we saw with the amputation, it has all kinds of contradictory explanations as well. So why then, or for a Muslim, I'm a Muslim now, I'm listening to you, why would the Sharia, why would these explanations or this fleshing out of chronic injunctions, why would that be important to me, or should that be important to me as a Muslim?
A Muslim is a muqallid. He follows the doctrine of taqlid. He's a follower. So he is someone who is beholden to the law of Allah, and he submits to Allah, and therefore he doesn't. I can go into detail within the Sharia to show you that Muslims are not to apply their own thinking. They are merely to obey and not question. In fact, to question is frowned upon. In fact, it's illegal, but also questions bring doubt. Doubt in Islam is illegal. They are just to be given these instructions, follow these instructions, do this. Doubt and anything that would cause doubt is illegal and must also be opposed vehemently. Right. So these are instructions given. We can actually go into the reliance, for instance, and cover those exact rules. Even your sense of morals. The Sharia says explicitly that you actually, may I just go there, Jay, and just actually bring that up, because that'll be very clear, if I may.
Go ahead.
Okay. Have a look here. It states very clearly within the Islamic law that we have a thing called the scholarly consensus. Here we have the scholarly consensus, the ijma, right? This is the ruling, the consensus ruling of all the scholars, the things they all agree upon that are binding in Islam. Notice that scholarly consensus is legally binding, right? The scholarly consensus is legally binding. Another thing that is important to note about the importance of Islamic law, notice here, it says when the four necessary integrals of consensus exist. These are the four things that say that here the scholars have consensus. They've all agreed. The ruling agreed upon is an authoritative part of sacred law that is obligatory to obey. It is not lawful to disobey, nor can mujtahids of a succeeding era, these are scholars of a following era, make the thing an object of new ijtihad, of new personal reasoning. The ruling on it, verified by scholarly consensus, is an absolute legal ruling. It does not admit of being contravened or annulled. The proof of the legal authority of scholarly consensus is that as Allah has ordered the believers in the Quran to obey Him and His Messenger, so too He has ordered them to obey those of authority among them, saying, "You believe, obey Allah, obey the Prophet, and those of authority among you." Such as when those of authority and legal expertise, the mujtahids, agree upon a ruling, it is obligatory in the very words of the Qur'an to follow them and carry out their judgment. And Allah threatens those who oppose the messenger and follow other than the believer's way. Does that answer your question, Jay? Go on, yeah.
So I can see that there will be problems with this, and I can see where there's some comeback. In fact, I would have problems with this right away. I can understand then why the earliest scholars like the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and the Hanbali school, how those scholars would have wanted these to be a ruling that is sacrosanct. It is sacrosanct for them. The problem with that is, why can't you not use ijtihad? Ijtihad means interpretation. Why can't you use later interpretation to change the ruling of something that is earlier? We call this progressive revelation in Christianity. I can see how somebody today say, well, that makes sense for in this case, the 9th, 10th, 11th century, but we're now in the 21st century. It makes no sense today. So what makes those mujtahids, who are the scholars of that time, what makes their ruling sacrosanct, since they're just humans and they're only talking about their place, their environment, their experience, their time? Today, we're in a new place, a new environment, a new experience, a new time, where our mujtahids today must transform it and bring it into a modern context. That would be the comeback that I would see on this. How would somebody from a Sharia standpoint?
This I will cover as we go through the slides. This will be made clear. This discussion will be addressed directly. The short answer now is that the earlier Muslims are obviously the best of Muslims.
What makes
they were the ones closest?
They're not close.
This is what is stated by the words of the Prophet.
But don't forget that they don't know the Prophet. None of these knew the Prophet. Look at the dates.
Well, this is our logic. This is not their logic.
This is 8th, 9th, and 10th century scholars.
There's what we think, and there's what they say. Understand? So they prefer their personal interpretations, not our personal ideas about that. So this is what is embedded within the culture.
This so they believe my mother and father speaking when I was a teenager, and they say, "We are the
what you're told.
We know best."
Correct.
And I was saying,
then you understand.
Best, but you don't know what's happening today. What is relevant to me? And so I can see how this could be a real kickback for those, and I can understand then why a lot of people, especially Muslims in the West, are saying that's for the old Islam. That is for the East. Remember what Yasir Qadhi said this. Yasir Qadhi said this to Muhammad Hijab in that infamous interview on June 8, 2020. You live in the East. The standard Islamic narrative is what you follow, but the standard Islamic narrative has holes in it. Remember when he said that? And we've been quoting it ever since. The standard Islamic narrative, SIN, has holes in it. He's saying that very thing. I live in the West. I live in America. I live in Houston. And what is for me today, I have to live in American context. I have to live in a completely different context. And he even said, you in the East. He's saying you in the East versus West. You in the East follow a precepts that no longer are relevant. And remember then what he said after that? He said, we in the West here have come leaps and bounds. And the scholars here have come leaps and bounds. The Western scholars he's talking about now, they know an awful lot more about qira'ats and ahruf. And they're looking at us, pointing to Muhammad Hijab, you in the East, as the emperor with no clothes on. This is really a problem showing that Sharia law, if it's going to be based on archaic understanding from the 9th, 10th, and century, written by men who never knew Muhammad and never lived where Muhammad lived or in the same century he lived
However, Muslims believe that these scholars, don't forget the idea, just them saying, have you consulted a scholar? This is endemic within their culture. They believe that those scholars, the very first, and again, I will go into detail as we go through the slides. These four founders of the schools of fiqh are infallible scholars. They are the absolute scholars. They are the perfect masters, the ones with the perfect understanding of Islamic law, of the will of Allah, which is the will of Allah and the will of Muhammad, the lawgivers. And they cannot make a mistake. They are divinely protected from error. Therefore, nothing in the Sharia can be wrong. Because remember, the Quran does say, today I have perfected your religion for you. And this application of it, right? So these direct laws, these known laws, these revealed laws, that's the Sharia, and the application, which is the fiqh, is entirely perfect. It is unquestionable, right? And in fact, it even defines what is morally right and wrong. Your own reasoning, the gates of ijtihad are closed. They are, so your own reasoning, for instance, it states within the Sharia, right, that bad and good are what the Sharia says, not what your conscience says. This is explicitly stated. So good is not what reason considers good, and bad is not what reason considers bad. The good and bad in Islam is what the Sharia says is bad, not your reason, not your conscience.
Understood, and I understand, but I can see that this is a huge hole, gaping hole for Muslims. It's a huge hole for anybody that is now trying to equate mujtahids, who are people who basically mujtahid is a person who does ijtihad, that's who does ijma. Ijma is an opinion, but the person's opinion is still that person.
Ijma is the consensus. The ijma is considered the consensus. Now there are levels of mujtahids. There are levels of mujtahids.
But they all come from the 19th century.
That may be.
They all come from Iraq.
True, but these four scholars who founded the four major schools of fiqh, in fact, the only four recognized schools of fiqh, plus the Jafari school in Shia Islam, these four scholars have a special status. They're given a special title. They are called mujtahids mutlaq. I will go into all of this. They're called the mujtahids mutlaq, the absolute scholars. These are the infallible, perfect, absolute masters of the Islamic law.
What gave them, and who is giving them that distinction?
No, we can talk about that. Those are in the slides, and so I'd like to get back to that. Then I can actually work through that as we go through it and do it step by step in a sequential fashion. Okay. So, but yes, but understand, this is what it is. It's maybe not what we want it to be, what we think it should be, but this is how it is viewed. This is what it is. This is what's in the written text. Above them, there's one additional scholar.
And this would be good for just this episode. That's good for people to know. Are you all following? So what Lloyd is saying is, we can sit here and we in the West can see that there are all kinds of holes to be punched into this. It's the same problem that we saw in that interview with our good friends, Muhammad Hijab and our good friend, Dr. Yasser Qadi. So that was a very inspiring interview showing what we're talking about right now. But Muslims don't ask this question. We are the ones asking this question. Certainly Muhammad Hijab was asking that question in that interview. And it's we who are seeing from the outside that this is going to create an enormous hole for Islam. Sharia law, by definition, is dictated by scholars, four of them that we've talked about so far, these four scholars of fiqh. There you have the Jafari school also as a fifth maybe. But
it's recognized, the Sunnis recognize the Jafari school.
Okay, so let's say five, just to make so we're comprehensive. And then the Shiites would have their own scholars that would be outside that, because these are Sunni scholars. And yet these are all from the 9th and 8th, 9th and 10th century. They are all much later.
That is correct.
And for that,
correct. Now, I will go through this history I will cover in detail. I'll go through it step by step sequentially.
Yeah, and we're going to do that because we want to see how it's applied and how Muslims are going to try to defend it. That is a huge weakness I can see right now. And I can see how we could use that. And for those Muslims who are watching this episode, are you going to give your whole practical application. This is practical application. How do you take what the Quran says and apply it to your place, to your time, to yourself in the 21st century, in 2022? How are you going to take this? You have, in some cases, you have no question. You cannot question it because it is seen as sacrosanct. But how can something that's written by men, thought of by men, be sacrosanct? So that's a question we're going to keep on asking. But thanks so much, Lloyd, for doing this. This is good to at least see that what we're dealing with here is a group of men who come together to find a consensus known as ijma, and then they take the verse that's in the Quran and they interpret that verse called ijtihad.
But these are four special mujtahids, the mujtahids mutlaq, and there's only one scholar above them. So there are 5 major scholars that define Islamic law, and then the rest take those ideas and have perfected them, refined them over the following centuries.
So are you all following that? So it is a rudimentary, regimented, and authoritative set of laws instituted in the 9th and 10th century, imposed on us in the 21st century, and yet it doesn't even have any standing within the 7th century. Fascinating. Yet that's something that we need to know so that we know how to then to engage with Muslims one-on-one, back and forth. God bless you. Thanks so much, Lloyd, for doing this for us today. This has been certainly informative. I'm interested to see where you're going to go next. But until that time, this is Lloyd in Poland and Jay here in the United States. Over and out.
Take care.